The 2026 FIFA World Cup, a historic expanded global event, is already getting overshadowed by politics because days before the official World Cup draw, Iran has announced it is boycotting the event in one.
So no one's coming to America anymore, and we might end up losing the World Cup and the Olympics. Tourism fell by 12% last month. That's the most since COVID. With then more specifically tourism from Germany and Denmark falling by over 30%. It's down by over 25% for Spain, Norway, Ireland, and Austria. Australia and France are down by 7%.
The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be too big to fail. 48 teams, 3 host countries. A record commercial machine built across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And yet, just months before kickoff, the conversation is no longer only about football. It is about who is welcome, who is not, and whether a tournament sold as global unity can survive being staged inside a political environment that increasingly looks selective, punitive, and unstable. FIFA's own chief operating officer has said the World Cup is too big to be postponed despite the Middle East conflict. That statement is revealing because it tells you FIFA knows the scale of the crisis and has already chosen its frame. Not whether the tournament is politically damaged, but whether it can still be commercially delivered. The word boycott is now everywhere, but the real story is more complicated than a single dramatic refusal. The 2026 World Cup is facing at least 3 different kinds of boycott pressure at once. First, the classic political boycott threat. Officials and public figures asking whether countries should refuse participation over U.S. behavior. Second, the fan boycott. Supporters deciding not to travel, whether out of anger, fear, cost, or visa exclusion. Third, the most explosive version of all, Iran, a qualified team deciding it cannot participate. And that last scenario is no longer theoretical. Reuters reported today that Iran's sports minister said Iran will not participate in the 2026 World Cup, citing U.S. and Israeli attacks and the resulting security environment. FIFA, meanwhile, is still publicly insisting the tournament will proceed and that Iran's team is welcome. That is where this story becomes bigger than sport. Because once a World Cup host must say out loud that a qualified team from a country it is effectively at war with is still welcome, the fiction of apolitical football is already broken. Reuters reports that Iran is scheduled to play all of its group matches in U.S. cities, and that a withdrawal now could bring fines and possible sporting sanctions under FIFA rules. FIFA is still speaking the language of universality. Iran is speaking the language of impossibility. That gap between FIFA's commercial script and geopolitical reality is the entire drama in one frame. And Iran is not the only fracture line. Back in January, Reuters reported that the Trump administration expanded visa travel exceptions for major sporting events, including the World Cup. But the same reporting made clear that only a small subset of travelers connected to those events would qualify. Athletes and essential personnel could get through. Fans, media, and corporate travelers from affected countries would generally not be admitted unless they independently qualified for an exemption. That is not a small bureaucratic detail. That is the difference between a global tournament and a television production. A team can appear. A fan base can still be locked out. That is why the boycott discussion has never really been only about formal national withdrawal. The more realistic version has always been erosion, partial absence, hollowed-out participation. A World Cup where the players are present but the atmosphere is thinner, the travel patterns narrower, and the legitimacy more fragile than the marketing promised. Even when governments reject a formal boycott, the reputational damage remains active. Reuters reported in January that France's sports minister did not expect France to boycott the World Cup over Trump's Greenland threats, and Germany's government also avoided endorsing withdrawal. That mattered because it showed the formal state line was still restraint. But restraint at the top does not cancel mistrust below. It just relocates it into fan behavior, federation caution, and public mood. And that mood matters because this tournament is built on movement. The World Cup does not simply sell football. It sells travel, hospitality, spectacle, density, convergence, and the illusion that the planet has gathered in one place. Once visa anxiety, immigration policing, geopolitical fear, and selective access enter that equation, the product itself changes. It may still happen. FIFA may still fill the schedule. Broadcasters may still show every match, but the claim of global openness starts to crack. That is what a boycott means in the modern era. Not always empty stadiums. Sometimes a less legitimate tournament delivered behind a wall of logistical success and political discomfort. And then there is the Greenland factor, which pulled Europe directly into the story. In January, Reuters reported that Trump threatened additional tariffs on several European countries unless the United States was allowed to buy Greenland. Reuters also reported that France did not intend to boycott the World Cup over those threats. That distinction matters. It shows the institutional center in Europe remains cautious. But it also explains why boycott talk became credible enough to enter mainstream discussion. Once the host country's president is threatening tariffs against allied governments over territorial ambition, the World Cup stops being just a sports event held in an imperfect democracy. It starts looking like an extension of geopolitical leverage. That is a very different reputational burden. This is why FIFA's silence has been so revealing. FIFA is not leading a moral discussion. It is managing operational risk. Reuters reported this week that the organization is closely monitoring developments tied to Iran and the wider Middle East conflict, while insisting the competition will go ahead. That is classic FIFA positioning. Calm the market, keep the calendar, avoid any statement that could force a confrontation with the host state. The tournament is too big. Translation: too much money has already been committed. Too many host city plans already locked in. Too many partners already exposed. The institution that presents football as a universal language is, in practice, behaving like any other giant commercial actor facing political turbulence. Preserve the asset first. And that is exactly why the boycott question keeps returning. Because people sense that the official conversation is smaller than the real one. FIFA asks. Can the event still happen? Critics ask. Should it happen like this? FIFA asks whether the schedule survives. Fans ask whether the idea survives. Governments ask whether they can avoid escalation. Athletes ask whether they will be allowed to compete. And now, in Iran's case, the question has become even sharper. Can a country participate in a tournament hosted by a state it now openly says it cannot safely enter? Reuters says Iran's sports minister answered that question with a no. So what are the plausible boycott scenarios now? The first is still the least likely but most dramatic. A coordinated political boycott by major football nations. Right now, the evidence for that is weak. Reuters, reporting from January, showed France stepping back from that path, and broader state responses in Europe have been careful, not revolutionary. That does not mean the idea disappears. It means no major coalition has crossed the line from outrage to coordinated withdrawal. The second is more plausible. Selective national or team-level disruption. Iran now sits at the center of that possibility. If Tehran follows through, it will not just be a symbolic rejection. It will force FIFA into a replacement, sanction, and legitimacy crisis. It will also prove that the too-big-to-fail narrative has limits. A tournament can still happen and still be politically diminished. And if one qualified team walks away because the host state is part of an active war against it, the precedent becomes impossible to ignore. The third is the most likely and, in some ways, the most damaging over time. Uneven participation without formal boycott. Fans from restricted countries stay out. Some supporters from unrestricted countries stay away by choice. Governments issue warnings instead of bans. Federations publicly monitor instead of act. FIFA insists everything is on track. The matches go ahead. The tournament survives on paper, but the trust deficit deepens. That version is harder to dramatize than a boycott headline, but it may do more damage to the idea of the event, because it normalizes exclusion without the clean rupture of protest. And that is where Canada and Mexico enter the story, not as co-host footnotes, but as contrast. The more politically charged the U.S. portion of the tournament becomes, the more the non-U.S. hosts begin to look like stabilizers. Even without any official match relocation, Canada and Mexico gain reputationally from being attached to the tournament without carrying the full symbolic burden of U.S. immigration enforcement, visa politics, or direct war entanglement. But if fan behavior shifts, that matters. If spectators decide they would rather attend matches north or south of the U.S., border that matters. If the United States becomes the controversial core, while Canada and Mexico are seen as accessible, welcoming, or simply less volatile, then the tournament's internal geography changes, even if the official schedule does not. That is how perception turns into economic asymmetry. So what is this World Cup becoming? Not exactly a canceled event, not yet a formal boycott, but no longer a clean festival of unity either. It is becoming a test case for whether global sport can keep pretending that access, war, borders, and diplomacy are secondary concerns. FIFA still wants the old story, football above politics, but the actual evidence points elsewhere. A host under geopolitical strain. A co-host structure that complicates any simple boycott. Visa rules that separate players from fans. European unease without coordinated action. And now a qualified team openly saying it cannot participate. That is not a normal pre-tournament controversy. That is a legitimacy problem. And the deeper question is not whether the tournament can technically be staged. It can. The deeper question is what kind of World Cup it becomes when access is selective, the host is politically combustible, and the governing body's main public position is that the event is simply too big to stop. Because once too big becomes the answer, you are no longer defending football's ideals. You are defending football's business model. So here is the real closing question. Will 2026 be remembered as the World Cup that survived every controversy? Or as the tournament that proved survival and legitimacy are not the same thing? See you on the next.